designing, I still only listen to the same crappy pop punk music I did in the early 2000s. I'm also one of those ridiculous dog moms who won't stop talking about my adorable little Shiba named Umbra. Um, I guess I should also mention I'm into video games, but I feel like that's pretty much everyone here. All right, so what is Game UI? Well, Game UI is a system of visual components that allows players to interact with the game story and break into the game space. Um, and there's four different types of UI that appears in games, and each has their different strengths and weaknesses. These four different types are non-diegetic, diegetic, spatial, and meta. I'll briefly go over each of these to explain their differences, but it all pertains to whether they exist in the game space or the game story. So the first and most common type is non-diegetic. Non-diegetic components reside outside of a game story and space. None of the characters in the game, including a player's avatar, are aware that the components exist. The design, placement, and context of non-diegetic components are paramount. In fast-paced games, non-diegetic components may interrupt a player's sense of immersion, but in strategy-heavy games, they can provide players with a more nuanced assessment of resources and actions. Non-diegetic components commonly appear in video games as like life and stat meters. They keep track of points, time, damage, and various resources that players amass and expend during gameplay. So, there's ring menus, there's level maps, there's life meters. They're pretty common components that appear in video games. The next type is diegetic. Diegetic UI components inhabit both a game story and space, and characters within the game are aware of the components. Even though they exist within the game story and space, poorly considered diegetic components are still capable of distracting or frustrating players. Scale can make diegetic components kind of tricky because, for instance, an in-game speedometer that resides on a vehicle's actual dashboard will likely be a bit too small for the players to see clearly. So in some games, handheld diegetic components, like maps, can be toggled to a 2D full screen view, making them non-diegetic eventually. But basically, this is anything that the character knows exists and the player can interact with. The next type is spatial UI, which are components found in a game space, but characters within the game don't see them. Spatial components often work as visual aids, helping players select objects or pointing out important landmarks. Text labels are a classic example of spatial UI components, as well as like player names. In fantasy and adventure games, players may encounter important objects that are unfamiliar in appearance, and text labels quickly remove ambiguity and keep players immersed in the gaming experience. So the last type is meta UI components, which exist in a game story, but they don't reside in a game space. A player's avatar may or may not be aware of meta components, and traditionally meta components have been used to signify damage to a player's avatar. So, whenever the screen gets red or it starts to get grimed up, that's like the most classic example. Meta components can be quite subtle, like a slowly accumulating layer of dirt on the game's 2D plane, but they can also feature prominently in the gaming experience. In action adventure games, the entire field of view is sometimes shaken, blurred, or discolored to show that a player has taken on damage. So, now that we've went over the different types of UI, what is the process of making it? So, this is the UI pipeline, and this is probably more traditionally for like AAA game studios, but it can be like tweaked and shortened and like done in a way that like it works for smaller scale games and all that, because for the most part you're going to be doing all these steps. So even at a AAA game studio, you might not do each of these steps each time, and sometimes it's a fluid process. It's all about designing the thing, and sometimes that takes iteration and going back. So the first step is the design brief. This isn't the responsibility of the UI UX designer necessarily, but the game designer. The point, though, is to have a brief that will go over the features or game, if it's smaller in scale, explaining how the users will interact with it and its purpose. This will be the foundation upon which to start exploring UI ideas and solutions. This step can include going over a feature overview, um, making user stories, and going through information prioritization of what information is important to the player. So briefs may even include some quick rough mock-ups of what the game designer is envisioning. And then this is when UI designers typically more step in. This will be the exploration phase. So we spend some time conceptualizing what the UI can be, research similar features in games, get inspiration, and brainstorm new concepts. At this stage, you should try and identify any potential problems and difficulties that may come up, since it'll make your life a lot easier later on. Um, and just gather as many ideas, problems, and solutions as possible so they can be explored next with a clear understanding of the requirements. A really good site to see UI from various games is Game UI Database. It's my personal favorite. Um, I have a resource section at the end, and I can share it later in Discord. There's also Interface in Game, which is pretty good. And also look for inspiration outside of games. You'll be surprised where you can find some inspiration when you open yourself up to it. Next, after exploration, you can try and create an inexpensive and interactive prototype of the UI. This is typically done in a program like Adobe XD or Figma, so coding isn't necessarily needed for this. The focus of this is on simple representation and fast iteration. Aesthetics do not matter yet. This is all about function. We just want to test ideas from the exploration stage and identify the best solution. So with the prototype we created, we can organize playtests and gather feedback and validate concepts. User researchers, UI designers, and game designers are responsible for this. And all stakeholders, which includes programmers, QA, and producers, should review the prototype and feedback that was given on it to decide if another iteration is needed or to proceed forward. So if another iteration is needed, you're going to go back to the exploration phase. The solution should meet the initial brief, provide a good user experience, is technically achievable, and doesn't exceed budget. After a solution is agreed on, a step at some game studios is for typically a role called a technical UI designer to implement the UI in-game. This implementation will have all the functionality that can be achieved without code support. So next step is now a programmer uses amazing dev skills to hook up the UI so it actually works and is functional. Documentation of how the UI works is very important for this step. I have nothing else to say about this step other than it's magic, because this is not the part that I would be doing or know much about. And then in tandem with the code support step is asset creation, since all the final assets aren't needed for the programmers to do their thing. All necessary assets are created: icons, backgrounds, textures, components, visual effects, animations, you name it. At the end of this, there should be no more placeholder assets. And there also might even be like a spreadsheet listing all the assets that will be needed, which will be come up with the game designer and the UI designer will work together to kind of figure that out. And next would be the copywriting phase. So now is when any placeholder text would be replaced with proper text strings. UI designers will probably handle the ones that relate more to the user experience. So like buttons, maybe navigation text, while game designers will handle flavor text. Also, all text will be prepared for final review and localization, probably all in a spreadsheet, because game dev sure is a lot of spreadsheets. And next, and the final step, if everything goes well, is that game designers, UI designers, and QA will test the gamer feature, provide feedback, and log bugs. Additionally, UX researchers can arrange tests with external players to gather more feedback. This isn't always going to happen, though. It's just kind of an optional thing. This time is used to further improve the UI, polish, and fix any new issues and bugs. And during this entire process, documentation should be created and maintained about the UI. Both the game and UI designer are responsible for this part. And doing this means there will be clear and up-to-date information that can be referenced at any point by anyone. This step is very important, and some people kind of forget about it. Um, so now that we know what game UI is and the process, how do we even start, or like what should you consider when starting to design your layouts and assets for the UI? Well, you can start by wireframing. Um, you can just get a layout down and figure out what elements you need on a screen. Wireframing is extremely valuable. This specific wireframe I'm showing is done by Anna Wickstrom for the main screen of Star Wars Battlefront 2. Um, wireframes can be considered low fidelity mockups. Um, I find wireframes most helpful for knowing to make sure you have all the information on the screen and that the hierarchy of everything is working. And if you have multiple screens like this, you could even hook them up and you can make them into a quick prototype to get an idea of the flow of everything and see if it's working. And then you can take your fancy wireframe and plop in some high fidelity assets at the end once those get made. So, and also another thing to consider in making UI is that you can animate and add motion to them. Your UI can be dynamic and not just like static and stay there. So animations can bring life to your UI and help convey information through movement. And like just on here, I have 12 examples of animations that are commonly done and can be used to convey different information. Another thing, as a general recommendation for text size, try and aim for a minimum size of 28 pixels for games at 1080p. This ensures your fonts will always be legible on both mobile and console devices, depending what you're making the game for. And just try and not have your type too small. This is like, a general recommendation, but too small type is probably my biggest game UI pet peeve. And the one that affects me the most is someone who has lower vision and needs glasses. And another important thing to bring up, I feel, is colorblindness. It's important to choose colors that will work for people who are colorblind. Otherwise, your game may become unplayable to them. 1 in 12 people with a single X chromosome experience colorblindness, since colorblindness is passed through the X chromosome. 300 million people have some form of colorblindness, and 1 in 30 people have low vision. So that's a lot of people. So thinking about this is important and should be part of your design process. You can test your game even to see how it looks with different types of color blindness to see if any issues pop up. And blues and oranges are typically a pretty safe combo to use if you need two opposing colors, since they'll look different with all the typical types of color blindness. And obviously the extra mile would be to let people be able to change some colors on the UI if it really is needed. And it's also good to think about not just using color as an indicator for things. So even if people are colorblind, they can still understand the information you're trying to convey to them. In general, it's good to try and convey information to people in 2 ways. So with this, we have the text string, and we also have an icon with it. So specifically in the little square that says non-color indicators, like you might have a legendary armor piece, and then people might know that the legendary armor is always coded purple, but if you also have the word, then people are going to know it's legendary regardless. So another good way of thinking about showing information to people in 2 ways is if a deaf or hard of hearing person is playing an FPS and potentially they get hit, they can still see indicators on the screen that they got hit and maybe even the direction it came from, even though they didn't hear the sound effect. So also, making sure everything has a high enough contrast is important as well. By choosing colors that have enough contrast with each other, you guarantee legibility for both color blindness and visual impairment. So underneath both of these login fields I have here, I used a contrast checker to see if the color of the text had enough contrast on the background color. The one on the left failed because there was not enough contrast between the light purple and the slightly darker light purple. While the one on the right passed with AAA accessibility standards, and there's tons of options online for contrast checkers to make sure that you hit accessibility standards and your colors have enough contrast with each other. Um, and I guess not that it can be very practical or doable for a game jam, but subtitles are a very important piece of UI. Um, Allowing players to toggle on subtitles allows them to tune into your story by reading the on-screen dialogue. Not only do they help hard of hearing and deaf players, but it also benefits non-native speakers. David Tesserand, I think is how you pronounce his last name, who does accessibility work at Ubisoft, has some pretty interesting stats that he posted on Twitter back in 2019, saying that for Far Cry New Dawn, it started up with subtitles on by default, and approximately 97% of players did not turn them off. And then Assassin's Creed Odyssey did the same, and about 95% of players didn't turn them off. And then in contrast, the Division 2 booted with subtitles off by default, and approximately 75% of players turned them on at least once. And at the time when he wrote the tweet, about 50% of people had them on. So, just some interesting food for thought, considering subtitles aren't always as considered as they should be. Yeah, so that was pretty much everything I was going to go over. It was a lot in a short period of time, but that's pretty much my little crash course on game UI. I have some links to resources here. These are places I reference, and I even gathered some of the material for this talk from some of these links. And I can share these out in the Discord afterwards. Yeah, so thanks for listening, everyone. I hope this presentation was helpful. And I just want to say, have fun doing the game jam if you're doing it. Be chill and get whatever you can done, and don't stress out about it. And before I leave, just like a shameless plug to follow me on Twitter at Jackie_Markey if you want to, where you will most likely see more pictures of my adorable dog Umbra. And if you ever have any questions about game UI or UX in general, just you can message me on Twitter or at me in the Winnipeg Game Collective server about anything, and I'll try my best to help.